By the end of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty in China was playing host to a party it never wanted to throw. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, basically any country with a steamship and an ego had shown up to carve out a sphere of influence. This was a polite term for grabbing a province and milking it for all it was worth. After a couple of opium wars and a series of documents called unequal treaties, which is a shockingly honest name, you have to admit, China was saddled with foreign troops, foreign missionaries, and foreign control over its own trade. This created a national mood that hovered somewhere between simmering rage and a full-blown identity crisis. The pressure was building, and something profoundly weird was about to boil over. Enter the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or as the Western press lazily nicknamed them, the Boxers. Originating in Shandong province, they weren't just a nationalist movement. They were a spiritual one with some truly wild ideas. Through a combination of martial arts, esoteric rituals, and chanting, they believed they could summon spirits to possess them. This possession, they claimed, made them completely immune to bullets. Let me repeat that. Their core military technology was faith-based ballistics shielding. They were convinced that Christian magic was disrupting China's spiritual harmony, causing droughts and famine, and the only solution was to physically punch all the foreigners, their railroads, and their churches out of existence. Now, you'd think the government's response to a massive, magic-powered, anti-foreigner death cult would be swift and decisive, and for a moment it was. The Qing court initially suppressed the Boxers, but then the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi had a change of heart. She was dealing with foreign powers who were not so subtly suggesting she should retire, and suddenly this grassroots movement chanting, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigner," looked less like a problem and more like a tool. A deeply unstable, potentially self-destructive tool, but a tool nonetheless. In early 1900, the Qing government did a complete 180 and threw its covert support behind the Boxers, essentially handing the keys to the kingdom to the guys who thought they could stop cannonballs with prayer. With the government unofficially looking the other way, the Boxers went to work. Their first targets were symbols of foreign influence. They tore up railway tracks, convinced the iron centipedes were angering the earth spirits. They pulled down telegraph poles, which they saw as demonic tools that disturbed the natural order. But their primary targets were people. Chinese Christians, who they viewed as traitors or secondary devils, were hunted down and murdered by the thousands. Foreign missionaries were next. The violence escalated with terrifying speed, spreading across northern China like a fire fed by decades of resentment and a healthy dose of magical thinking. By June 1900, the Boxer movement flooded into Beijing itself. Their next logical target? The Legation Quarter. This was a small, walled-off compound where all the foreign diplomats, their families, and staff lived. Think of it as the world's most stressful international cul-de-sac. As thousands of Boxers and Imperial Army soldiers surrounded the compound, the foreigners inside, about 475 civilians and 450 soldiers from a mishmash of 8 different nations, fortified their position. On June 20th, after a German diplomat was killed, the Qing government made its position official by declaring war on pretty much everyone. The 55-day siege of the legations had begun.
Life inside the siege was a masterclass in desperate improvisation. Food was rationed, dwindling from regular supplies to pony meat and musty rice. Water was scarce. To counter the Chinese artillery, the defenders cobbled together a cannon of their own. An old British cannon barrel was mounted on an Italian gun carriage, fired using Russian shells, and manned by an American gunner. They called it the international gun, because nothing brings people together quite like the imminent threat of being overrun by an army that believes it's bulletproof. For 55 days, this small multinational force held out against overwhelming odds, hoping a relief force was on its way.
Meanwhile, the outside world scrambled to react. The result was the 8-nation alliance. Japan, Russia, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary all sent troops. This wasn't some noble humanitarian mission. It was a group of imperial rivals who all agreed that China shouldn't be allowed to kick them out, and who also secretly wanted to secure more loot and influence for themselves. Their march from the coast to Beijing was brutal. The Boxers, following their spiritual doctrine, charged machine guns with swords. The results were predictable. Their magic consistently failed to stop bullets, a design flaw of staggering proportions. On August 14, 1900, the 8-nation alliance broke through the walls of Beijing and lifted the siege. And then, the civilized rescuers proceeded to engage in a city-wide campaign of looting, pillaging, and violence that was, in many areas, even more horrific than what the Boxers had done. Soldiers from every nation ransacked palaces, private homes, and government buildings. Priceless artifacts from the Forbidden City were stolen and shipped back to museums in Europe. The city was plundered for weeks. It was a stunning display of hypocrisy, proving that, when it came to brutality, religious fervor had nothing on organized, state-sanctioned greed. After the dust settled, it was time for the punishment. The Boxer Protocol, signed in 1901, was less a treaty and more a bill for services not rendered. China was forced to execute 10 high-ranking officials and pay a war indemnity of 450 million taels of silver. To put that in perspective, it was more than the government's entire annual tax revenue, and it was to be paid over 39 years with interest, effectively doubling the final amount. Foreign troops were also given the right to be permanently stationed in Beijing. The attempt to drive out the foreigners had resulted in more foreigners, with more power, and a debt that would cripple the country for decades. The Boxer Rebellion was a catastrophe from every possible angle. It was born from genuine grievance, but channeled into a xenophobic fury fueled by superstition. Empress Cixi's gamble to use the Boxers as a weapon backfired spectacularly, destroying the last shreds of the Qing dynasty's authority and legitimacy. It paved the way directly for the 1911 revolution that would finally end millennia of imperial rule in China. It was a tragic, bloody, and often absurd lesson in what happens when a nation's desperation, a government's cynical opportunism, and a movement's belief in its own invincibility collide with the hard reality of modern firepower. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!